Welcome to Sleeping Radio Channel, where we travel gently through time with calm stories to help you fall asleep. Tonight I will take you on a long, quiet journey through the life of Alexander the Great. Make sure you are in a comfortable place, away from harsh light and sudden noise. Take a slow, deep breath in and let it leave your chest softly without any hurry. You are now about to join a journey that stretches back more than 2,030 years into the past. We will go to a world very different from ours on the surface, but very similar in its power, ambition, and complicated human dreams. Our story tonight is about one of the most fascinating figures for historians, not only because his life was full of wars, but because his entire life feels like a story that would be hard to believe if history had not written it down. Many leaders passed through the civilizations of the ancient world. Yet one name remained for centuries as a symbol of conquest, impulse, cultural mixing, and an imperial dream that refused to accept limits. That name is Alexander the Great. He was born like any other child, but he was raised on the idea that the world could be shaped by the will of a single man. When he died in his youth, before reaching his mid-30s, he had already changed the map of the ancient world. He rose across history like a meteor and burned like a meteor, bright and fast and passing. He left behind cities that carried his name, confused armies that no longer knew their home, and an empire that stretched from Greece to the edges of India. He also left a cultural impact that echoes quietly even to this day. Despite all of that, Alexander was not a romantic hero or a gentle angel. He was a ruthless conqueror who led endless campaigns and left behind rivers of destruction wherever he advanced. In his life, there were bright sides and very dark sides. Inside him there was something of the thoughtful leader, something of the harsh conqueror, and something of the dreamer who never learned how to stop. This contradiction is exactly what makes his story worth slow reflection. Before we begin, remember to press like and subscribe to the channel so you can travel with us every time to another age where details tell their stories without hurry. Tonight we will move slowly, without rushing, passing through the details as if we are watching old cities, long marches, and distant battles. We will not stand in the fire of events, but at a safe, calm distance that turns them into quiet scenes in an old book you leaf through before sleeping. Take another deep, relaxed breath and let your shoulders soften. Now the long road toward the world of Alexander the Great begins. Far in the north of the ancient Greek world, where green mountains rise and cold mist wraps their peaks in winter, the kingdom of Macedonia took shape. It was never the proud center of Greek civilization, and cities like Athens or Sparta did not see it as their equal in status. It was closer to a borderland, half mountainous and half open plain. Its people lived between raising horses, working the fields, and dealing with tribal conflicts that rarely slept. Yet in this distant place, the first seed of a leader who would change the course of history was planted. In this environment, Alexander was born in the small Macedonian capital of Pella. His birth was in the year 356 before Christ, in the palace of King Philip II. Philip was the man who built the foundations that allowed his son to appear as a historical phenomenon. Philip himself was not an ordinary king. He was a seasoned warrior who reorganized the Macedonian army and created a new style of fighting known as the phalanx. The phalanx was a tight formation of infantry carrying very long spears and moving as one solid block, like a human wall that could hardly be broken. This powerful army was what Alexander later inherited, and it became his decisive weapon in most of his early battles. Alexander's childhood was a mixture of royal discipline and deep observation. It is said that from a young age he loved quiet contemplation and watching the nature around him. He would sit for long periods beside the small streams that flowed near Pella. He watched the water slide between the stones with calm persistence. Perhaps in those silent moments he did not yet know that his future path would not be like the smooth flow of water. His life would be stormy, full of collisions and conquests. Alongside this reflective side of his character, there was a strict physical training. From childhood he learned horse riding, wrestling, and throwing weapons. King Philip was very careful that his son grow into a capable heir, not a spoiled prince. One day an event happened that seemed simple at first, but became one of the most famous stories in the history of leaders. A man came to the king offering to sell him a strong black horse that was extremely wild and stubborn. The king's soldiers tried to tame the horse, but it refused to obey and kept rearing violently. Philip grew angry and ordered the horse to be sent away. Then the young Alexander, who had not yet reached the age of 13, stepped forward with steady steps and said that he could tame it. Silence filled the courtyard for a moment. Then the king agreed with a mocking smile. Alexander approached the horse slowly and noticed that it was terrified of its own shadow. So he gently turned the horse's head toward the sun so that the shadow fell behind it. With a calm hand he stroked its neck until it relaxed. After a few minutes he succeeded in mounting it and rode it across the royal square in front of everyone. That horse was Bucephalus, the companion who would ride with Alexander through most of his campaigns until the end of its life. However much the story was decorated and exaggerated over the centuries, it reflects something essential. Alexander did not see obstacles as others saw them. He always searched for a small opening, a different angle, another way around the familiar problem. This early mental ability was part of the secret of his rapid rise later on. It was not physical training alone that shaped Alexander. The mind had its share as well. King Philip brought a very special teacher for his son, a man almost as famous in philosophy as his student in war. That teacher was the philosopher Aristotle. Imagine the deep voice of Aristotle explaining to the young boy the principles of the world, the nature of the universe, ethics, and politics. Imagine Alexander sitting in front of him, listening and learning about Homer and the Iliad, and about the Greek heroes who fought the legendary wars. Alexander was especially fascinated by the figure of Achilles. He believed that he was one of Achilles' distant descendants, and those stories planted in his heart the idea that his life was not ordinary. He felt that he was destined for something greater than ruling a small northern kingdom. Day after day, the personality of Alexander was formed between two clear influences. On one side stood his father Philip, the hard military king. On the other stood Aristotle, the calm philosopher. It was a blend of sword and thought, of ambition and values, of harshness and wisdom. But time was carrying heavy changes, and the future rarely moves in straight lines. Between the mountains of Macedonia, the quiet streets of Pella, the teachings of Aristotle, and the stern presence of Philip, the path of the boy who would become the greatest conqueror began. It was a long road still at its beginning. Soon it would take him into a new stage, into his teenage years, then toward the test of the throne, and after that to the first real step toward his greatest dream, the dream of conquering the world. Alexander grew older, and with his age the expectations placed on his shoulders grew heavier. In the royal palace of Pella, his footsteps were not heard as the steps of a small prince. People heard in them the echo of a possible successor who carried the hopes of an entire kingdom. As the years passed, he became more aware of the distance between Macedonia on the edge of Greece and the centers of power in the south. Cities like Athens, Sparta, and Thebes often looked toward Macedonia with a hidden sense of superiority, and sometimes with open contempt. Even though Alexander had learned from Aristotle the language of balance and moderation, daily life in Macedonia obeyed a different logic. Politics there did not follow pure wisdom. It obeyed power. Neighboring tribes were always watching for weakness, and small wars on the borders flared for reasons that seemed trivial. In this atmosphere, Alexander got used, from his youth, to hearing the word danger before he heard the word philosophy. He saw swords before he saw scrolls. Philip II, Alexander's father, was a man no one could ignore or escape. He was imposing, ambitious, and unfamiliar with retreat. He was leading a huge project to unite the Greek cities under Macedonian rule, then turned toward a larger target that floated on his horizon, the conquest of the Persian Empire. That dream was not new in Greek minds. Ever since the old wars between Greeks and Persians in the 5th century before Christ, many Greeks had imagined a counter-invasion of Asia. Many dreamed of it, few tried, and Philip was the first to work seriously to turn this dream into a realistic plan. Thus, Alexander found himself between two great forces shaping his inner world. From Aristotle he took the power of thought. From Philip he absorbed the burning military ambition. With time, small signs of difference between father and son began to appear. Alexander did not see himself as simply a follower, even if he followed his own father, the king. His ambition grew quietly inside him, like a tree that spreads its roots in the ground at night where no one can see. There was another strong influence on Alexander, his mother, Olympias. She was a woman with a forceful presence, described by some ancient writers as intense in temperament and complex in mood. She believed deeply that her son was not like other children, that he had a special destiny. This belief was one of the early psychological forces that molded Alexander's view of himself. Her relationship with Philip was tense and full of jealousy and emotional struggle. Alexander therefore grew up inside a family where love mixed with rivalry and hidden wounds. As a child and as a teenager, Alexander watched how Philip dealt with allies and enemies. He saw that politics was only another face of war. Beautiful words were merely a short rest between rounds of sharp swords. From all these scenes, Alexander learned that the world does not wait for the hesitant, and that a dream without power is only a poem that no one reads. Around the age of 16, the clear outlines of a young commander began to appear in him. When Philip left for a northern campaign, he left Alexander in charge of governing in his absence. This happened before Alexander reached 18 years of age. Despite this, he behaved with the confidence of a ruler, not a child. He led a small army to crush a local revolt on the borders of the kingdom. On that spot, he founded a new city, leaving his first political footprint on the map. This short experience sent an early message to his kingdom, to Greece, and to Philip himself. The young prince was not only the son of a king, he was the project of a real leader. As Philip's fame increased and the kingdom expanded, the base of their shared dream grew. But every step the father took toward his great goal made Alexander more determined to prove himself to everyone. He did not want to remain a shadow cast by his father. His own ambition, though silent on the surface, was like fire hidden under ashes waiting for the right wind. Those winds came faster than anyone expected. Politics in Greece and tensions inside the royal family were moving toward a sharp turning point. For the first time, the road to power stood clearly in front of Alexander. It was a road that did not pass through quiet learning or popular praise, but through hard conflicts, some loud and some quiet. As Alexander grew closer to his early 20s, the critical stage of his life became clearer. The kingdom was changing quickly, conspiracies were multiplying, and alliances were shifting. It seemed as if everything around him was being rearranged to test the inner mettle of the young prince. At that time, Alexander was no longer only a king's son watching events. He became part of the political game itself, sometimes pushed into it, sometimes stepping into it on his own. Philip was living the peak of his political and military power. After forcing most of the Greek cities to join his Corinthian League, his dream of leading a great campaign east against Persia was now very close. As his influence spread, the circle of danger around him widened. A rising king attracts envy, hatred, and hidden grudges. During those years, the relationship between Alexander and his father was shaken more than once. Respect and admiration were real, but they did not stop tension from growing. Part of that tension was political, and part of it was purely family-related. Philip married a new Macedonian noblewoman, and that marriage caused a storm in the palace. Alexander's mother felt threatened, not only in her position as queen, but in the future place of her son as legitimate heir. Alexander felt insulted when some of Philip's close men hinted that the next heir might be another child yet to be born. This was not just family drama. In royal courts of the ancient world, marital fights were tied directly to the future of thrones, armies, and alliances. In this heavy atmosphere, Alexander stepped a little away from the palace and spent some time surrounded by his own companions and loyal soldiers, as if he was preparing himself mentally for possible confrontation. Even so, the bond between father and son did not vanish completely. When real external danger approached, they returned to the same side. In one northern campaign against Thracian tribes, Alexander fought bravely next to Philip. He rushed into battle like a commander, not like a prince. Though the family conflicts were deep, these moments reminded both of them of a bond greater than their disputes. It was the shared project of Macedonia. Yet fate had another, sharper chapter prepared, one that could not be avoided. During a celebration in the city of Tyre, at a political wedding meant to secure a new alliance, the decisive event happened. In the middle of the festivities, among the crowds, one of the royal guards advanced and stabbed Philip with a knife. Philip II fell dead in a shocking scene for the entire kingdom. The king died in a single unguarded moment. Questions did not die with him. Who planned this? Who encouraged the killer? Was it personal revenge or a broader plot? Historians offered many explanations. The only certain fact was this: the throne was suddenly empty. Whenever the center of power collapses this quickly, struggle never waits long before it begins. In those first hours after Philip's assassination, Alexander himself was in real danger. The absence of a king meant that rivals would move forward and ambitious men would raise their heads. Alexander showed unusual steadiness for a man in his early 20s. He moved fast, took control of the situation, and closed the door in the face of chaos. With the support of the experienced Macedonian army that had served his father, he managed to impose himself as the rightful heir. Not only through force, but through a presence the soldiers seemed to have accepted long ago. Within a few days, Alexander became king of Macedonia at a very young age. He now stood at the head of a strong kingdom surrounded by threats from every side. The Greek cities were watching him with worry, and many of them hoped that the death of Philip would mean the end of Macedonian domination. Northern tribes were waiting for a chance to rebel. Far away in the east, the Persian Empire observed the scene, not yet realizing that this young new king would soon become its greatest enemy. Alexander took the throne, but what he inherited was a kingdom wrapped in doubt. Philip's murder had fallen into the still water of the political lake like a huge stone. Waves spread in all directions. The Greek cities forced into the alliance by Philip now saw a golden chance to escape northern control. Thracian and Illyrian tribes to the north began preparing for revolt. The Persians stood on the edge of this stage, watching, unaware that the real danger was not the dead king, but the living heir who was just beginning his path. In the first days after his father's death, Alexander had to stare directly into the face of possible collapse. Any hesitation or delay could have torn the kingdom apart before he even sat firmly on the throne. He understood well that in times of turmoil, decisive speed is the first weapon, so his first steps were firm and clear. He reorganized the royal court, removed those he doubted, and fixed loyal men in the most sensitive positions, especially inside the army. The army was the backbone of Macedonian rule. Its loyalty drew the line between a transient ruler and a legitimate king. Because Philip had trained his soldiers in discipline and loyalty, Alexander found among them a solid base, still devoted to the royal family and ready to obey the son as they obeyed the father. The danger, however, was not internal alone. To the south, some Greek cities began hinting at rebellion. Athens, in particular, hoped that Philip's death would mean the end of Macedonian control. Thebes, always proud of its military strength, also considered leaving the alliance. For Alexander, this was a clear message. If he did not prove his strength quickly, everything his father built would collapse in a few short weeks. In his first year on the throne, Alexander personally led his army in a swift campaign north and south at the same time. His movements were so fast that his enemies could not organize their forces. He first secured his northern borders by crushing the Thracians, then he turned south into the heart of Greece. His message to the cities was quiet but sharp. Macedonia had changed its king, but not its power. When he reached Greek lands, some cities quietly backed away from the idea of revolt. Thebes did not. It chose confrontation, perhaps believing that a young man in his 20s could not carry the same weight as Philip. Alexander was not looking for a long war. He wanted one clear example that would make the other cities understand without many battles. When Thebes refused to submit, he surrounded it and stormed it quickly and decisively. The goal was not simple destruction of a city, but the destruction of the idea of rebellion. In a few days, the resistance of Thebes collapsed. Alexander's strict orders afterward made the other Greek cities absorb the message in silence. Athens, which had hoped for a general uprising, contented itself with quiet withdrawal and did not dare open war. With one swift campaign, Alexander fixed his control over all of Greece. This was a decisive moment. The youth many had thought a weak link proved that his grip could be as strong as his father's, maybe sharper. Though he did not enjoy needless cruelty, he understood early that ruling a restless land sometimes requires power first and politics later. After the cities calmed down and the Greek states gathered in something like collective recognition of his leadership, Alexander was confirmed as supreme commander of the Corinthian League, just as Philip had been. Only then, once his home front was stable, could he lift his eyes toward the east. The greater target now lay before him again, the Persian Empire. The first storm of his reign had passed. The throne was steady, his ambition wide open, and the borders secure. It was time to move from the stage of consolidation to the stage of expansion. After Alexander had put out the fires of revolt in Greece and confirmed his authority over the cities that had been waiting to slip away, he turned his gaze once more toward the east. The Aegean Sea was no longer the final edge of his world. It became only the beginning of a much longer road. The dream that had once lived inside Philip, the dream of defeating Persia, was still alive. Now it left the hand of the father and settled in the hand of the son. Alexander did not see himself as simply completing Philip's plan. He saw himself creating a larger vision, reshaping the map of the ancient world. Before marching east, he spent some months in careful planning. This was not hesitation. It was the calm of someone preparing for a very long storm. The coming war was not a skirmish with a single Greek city. It was a confrontation with one of the greatest and richest empires of that age, stretching from Western Asia to deep lands in the east. Although Persia had suffered rebel movements and internal troubles, it remained a massive power. To attack it was a fateful decision, like opening a door that could never be closed again. For Alexander, this war did not feel like a gamble. It felt like the natural next step in a rising line. He had grown up listening to tales of Achilles. He carried Aristotle's teaching about power and order in his mind. From childhood he had believed that the world could be wider than the shores of Greece and the Aegean Sea. He seemed to trust completely that fate was walking beside him. In the spring he began his real movement east. He reached the narrow waters that separate Europe from Asia, the straits later called the Dardanelles, facing the coast of Asia Minor. There he stood before the sea that divided his familiar world from the Persian lands. The scene was quiet, but its meaning was deep. He was crossing out of his old world into another. It is said that he went to the legendary city of Troy and offered a peaceful sacrifice at the tomb of Achilles, as if tying his own coming story to that of his mythical hero. When the army finished crossing, Alexander had about 40,000 soldiers with him, along with excellent Macedonian cavalry that was among the best in the world. Compared to the vast resources of Persia, this was not a huge army in numbers, but it was tightly organized and trained in the tactics Philip had invented and Alexander himself had refined. Its strength was not in its size, but in the way it fought. The first real test against Persian forces came quickly at a river in Asia Minor. A group of Persian commanders had united to block the Macedonian advance at the very first step. If Alexander lost that first encounter on Asian soil, the whole campaign might break before it started. Yet he did not meet the situation with panic or showy anger. He moved with calm confidence. He chose the right moment to attack, used his cavalry to hit a weak point in the Persian formation, and within hours the battle was his. The result was not only a military victory, it was a symbolic announcement that the opening of the East had begun. From then on, many Greek cities that had been under Persian rule began to open their gates before him one by one. Some welcomed him out of admiration, others out of fear, and some because they preferred him as a liberator rather than as a foreign conqueror. He received these cities without wild destruction. He allowed some a measure of self-rule under his protection, changed governors in others, and tried to turn them into fixed bases on his long road inside Asia. Despite the speed of his early successes, Alexander remained watchful. He knew that Persia's true strength had not yet appeared. King Darius III was still watching from a distance, waiting to choose a larger battlefield. Alexander was in no rush for one final clash. He did what seasoned commanders do at the beginning of grand campaigns. He made his first steps firm, slowly and carefully, then moved with growing confidence to the next ones. As the western coast of Asia Minor fell under his control, Alexander continued inland with steady eyes and a steady heart. He carried no thought of turning back. His ambition did not see the end of the road anywhere except at the heart of the Persian Empire itself. From here the story will go on into greater depth, following his march through Asia, his clash with Darius, his siege of Tyre, His calm entry into Egypt, his burning of Persepolis, his long chase in the eastern mountains, his wanderings in Central Asia, his battle with the Indian king Porus, the moment when his army refused to go any farther, his heavy return to Babylon, and the quiet final fever that ended his life. For now, let your breathing stay slow and soft, and let your mind float gently with what you have heard, as if you are watching Alexander's world from very far above, where everything is small and distant, and where history itself begins to feel calm. After Alexander had firmly set his feet on the shores of Asia Minor, he began to move slowly inward, not as a man rushing through unknown lands, but as someone drawing the first quiet lines of a large painting. The old coastal cities with a Greek spirit fell under his control, one after another, not through blind destruction, but through calm annexation that made their people feel they were moving from one ruler to another, not from one civilization to a completely different one. In this early stage, another side of Alexander appeared, his ability to attract people in ways that were not purely military. He did not behave like a conqueror who hated the East or despised its customs. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in understanding the traditions of the lands he entered. He listened to local leaders and honored their temples and rituals. He allowed many cities a degree of self-rule as long as they did not threaten his march or his supply lines. This flexible diplomacy was part of the secret of his early success, because it made many Eastern cities see in him an opportunity, not a pure danger. Even so, the scene was not completely calm, because, deep inside the empire, the Persian king, Darius III, was watching the news with growing concern. Alexander was no longer just a young, ambitious general leading a limited adventure. He had become a real force, moving step by step toward the heart of the empire. Darius understood that he could not depend on local commanders forever. He had to move personally, because the prestige of Persia itself was now at stake. An empire whose roots stretched back for centuries across lands from Egypt to Central Asia. He began gathering a great army and planned a meeting that he wanted to be decisive. He did not want a small skirmish, but a battle that would remind Asia and the wider world that Persia was still the great power of the East. Before he faced Darius directly, Alexander kept advancing through Asia Minor and beyond. Some cities surrendered peacefully, others resisted and closed their gates. The cities that chose resistance did not push him toward wild revenge, but he remained firm in enforcing the results of their defeat. He knew that softness at this stage could cost him the trust of his soldiers, who were watching every decision and measuring the strength of their young king. While his army marched between mountains, valleys, and wide plains, Alexander kept to his daily habit. He sometimes walked on foot among his men without a heavy royal guard, speaking with them, hearing their stories, and sharing their food from time to time. This simple closeness made him nearer to his soldiers than any king they had known before. He did not walk in front of them only, he walked with them. So when danger came later, they fought behind him with deep loyalty, not only from fear of punishment, but from a sense that he was one of them, only carrying a heavier burden. With these steady steps, the long-awaited moment finally arrived, the first direct meeting with Darius III. This clash took place near the town of Issus in the south of Asia Minor, in a narrow strip of land pressed between mountains and sea. The ground did not fit large open maneuvers. This was to Alexander's advantage, because the Persian army was much larger than his own. But the tight space made this great number harder to use. Darius thought that numerical superiority would be enough to crush the Macedonian advance. Alexander saw the field with different eyes, the eyes of a commander who believed that discipline in a narrow space can defeat disorganized mass, no matter how large. When the battle began, Alexander took his usual place at the head of the cavalry on the right wing of his army. He waited for the right moment, then launched a sharp attack on a weak point in the Persian line. His strike was focused and quick, like a gust of wind passing through a crack in the rocks. The Persian front began to split and bend, and in a critical moment Darius himself left the field, feeling the balance push against him. The victory at Issus was not a small success. It was the first time the Persian king himself suffered a clear defeat in direct battle against the newcomer from the west, and this had a deep psychological effect on both sides. For Alexander, the road into the empire suddenly felt more open. For many Persians, doubt began to grow quietly around their king's ability to protect their long-standing glory. Without loud celebrations, Alexander continued his advance. He did not care about victory as noise, he cared about the next steps on the ground. For him, war was not a single moment, but a long chain of connected moments. He now turned toward a different task, securing the eastern Mediterranean coast before going deeper into the land. After Issus, Alexander understood that as long as Persia held a strong fleet at sea, his own rear and supply routes on the coast would remain exposed. So before marching inland to the great capitals of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, he decided to secure every major coastal city. He wanted to deny Persia the sea and protect his back from any naval surprise. This decision opened a new chapter in his campaign. A chapter where the main enemy would be strong walled port cities more than open field armies. On his way down the Levantine coast, he passed through ancient Phoenician cities that had lived for centuries from trade, shipbuilding, and dye. Many of these cities chose peaceful submission, formally loyal to Persia, but not eager to suffer for Darius after the shock of Issus. Only one city decided to close its gates and refuse his entry. That city was Tyre. Tyre was different. It did not stand directly on the mainland but on a rocky island just off the coast, ringed by high walls that rose straight from the water, looking over the sea with both courage and cold confidence. It knew that control over it meant control over a key part of the coast. When Alexander asked to enter and offer sacrifice in its famous temple, the city refused firmly. The refusal was not just a political gesture. It expressed the deep self-confidence of a city that had resisted mighty empires before. Tyre had survived Assyrian and Babylonian attempts in the past. Its people believed that Macedonia, no matter how successful, was simply another wave that could be resisted or outweighted. Alexander now stood before a difficult choice. He could simply bypass Tyre and continue south toward Egypt, leaving it behind as a hostile naval base, or he could stop and force it to submit. Passing by might have seemed quicker on the surface, but it would mean leaving a sharp thorn behind him that could pierce his supply lines at any time. Alexander had a simple principle: what is opened is completed, and what is fortified and threatening is not left behind. Yet how do you besiege an island protected by high walls and warships? Here one of the most impressive engineering scenes of his career took shape. He decided to build a long causeway, a solid arm of earth and stone reaching from the shore to the island. His soldiers brought stones, timber, and earth, and began filling the shallow water step by step. Over many months, this artificial bridge extended into the sea like a quiet, stubborn hand. The work was slow, exhausting, and dangerous. The Tyrian fleet attacked from time to time, and winds and waves battered the growing structure. But the work did not stop. The advancing causeway became a symbol of Alexander's own character: patient, determined, and unwilling to turn back. From the walls of Tyre, people watched with surprise. They had not imagined that the young king from the north would choose the longer, harder way instead of attempting a quick naval assault. As time passed, the pressure of the siege grew heavier. Alexander's fleet, strengthened by ships from Greek and Phoenician ports that had joined him, tightened the ring from the sea while the causeway slowly reached their very walls. Between the waves and the stones, time seemed to move slowly. The world outside followed the news of this long, quiet struggle, which had become more than a conflict between an army and a city. It turned into a test of will. Tyre defended its proud maritime heritage, and Alexander proved that he could be an engineer and architect of war as much as a field commander. Throughout these months, Alexander kept his image as a close leader. He walked on the causeway himself, inspected the work, and spoke with soldiers who labored day and night in salty water and harsh conditions. Finally, after long effort, the causeway reached the island and the final assault began. Alexander attacked on several fronts, and his ships battered the sea walls. As certain defensive points collapsed, the balance of power shifted. Tyre fell at last in a hard moment of its long history. Alexander entered the city as a determined victor, without wild celebration. For him, this fall was not the end but a necessary step before the next stage. The proud city of Tyre, which had ruled the sea for centuries, became a station on a longer road. Despite the harshness of the siege, Alexander then set about reorganizing life there. Many inhabitants were allowed to return or remain, and port activity was preserved under Macedonian supervision. He understood the value of coastal cities as arteries of trade and communication. He did not want to turn all of them into ruins. What mattered to him was that Tyre was no longer a Persian base, and that the Mediterranean no longer held a dangerous enemy stronghold on his western flank. After Tyre, the road south opened. Only Gaza remained as a strong land fortress before Egypt. Gaza resisted fiercely on its hill above the desert road. Alexander insisted on storming it, despite being wounded in the shoulder during the fighting. Even wounded, he held to his quiet principle. No strong point is bypassed without being settled. With Gaza subdued, the way to Egypt lay open. The Egyptians, long tired of Persian rule, saw in Alexander a chance to breathe under a different sky. Instead of resistance, he was met with welcome, sometimes even with celebration. In Egypt, the rhythm of life felt different from the rocky coasts and steep mountains of the Levant and Anatolia. The Nile flowed gently, and agricultural life continued with its ancient steady pattern that had survived empires and dynasties. Alexander saw a land with roots deep in time, older than Greece and older than Persia, with its own gods, language, and sacred carved stones. He treated Egypt with notable respect. He visited its old temples, and priests presented him as a liberator from Persian rule. He then took a step rich in symbolism by founding a new city on the Mediterranean shore, Alexandria. He wanted it to be a bridge between East and West, a harbor of trade and knowledge. Later history would make of it exactly that, a place where cultures and ideas met for centuries. Afterward, he crossed the desert to the oasis of Siwa and visited the sanctuary of the god Amen. There, surrounded by the silence of sand and the endless horizon, he heard words that increased his inner certainty that his life carried a special destiny. Whether those messages were real or colored by later stories, they deepened the feeling that his campaign was more than politics and war. It became, in his mind, a journey of fate that would not end until he reached the farthest lands. After a few relatively calm months in Egypt, he turned once more toward his first target. The final settlement with Darius and Persia still waited. Alexander marched back to the east. By now, the political and military scene in Persia had changed deeply. Darius still ruled the largest empire on earth in area, but he faced a hard truth. His armies had numbers, but lacked spirit. Cities that once saw him as their protector now doubted his star. Every defeat he had suffered against Alexander had left another scratch on his royal image. Alexander moved with growing confidence. The rest in Egypt had given his army time to recover and reorganize. They were now more experienced, more disciplined, and more loyal to a king who did not hide behind them but rode at their front. This factor alone made Macedonia, despite its small size compared to Persia, seem almost unstoppable. He advanced through the eastern lands, crossing the Euphrates and moving closer to the inner body of the empire. The cities around him became richer, the Persian palaces more frequent and grand, surrounded by gardens and long roads. Darius gathered a new army, larger than anything he had fielded before. He chose a broad plain near a place called Gaugamela, near ancient Nineveh in what is now Iraq. The open terrain suited Persian style, which relied on huge numbers of cavalry and war chariots with blades fixed to their wheels. Darius was sure this battle would be different from He had prepared the ground for months, even leveling it and clearing stones to allow the chariots to move easily. When Alexander learned of his position, he did not back away or search for a way around. He knew that the decisive moment could not be delayed forever. If the march to the east was a long journey, then Gaugamela was its great gate. The evening before the battle, the Macedonian camp was quiet. Soldiers rested, horses stood ready, and tents formed calm rows under the night sky. It is said that Alexander slept peacefully that night, in a way that surprised some of his commanders. When one asked him how he could rest so calmly before the greatest battle of his life, he answered simply that they had finally reached what they had been seeking. Across the plain, Darius spent most of the night awake, moving among his officers, checking formations, rearranging units. The psychological difference between the two leaders was clear. Darius was defending a threatened empire. Alexander was chasing a dream that had grown with every mile. At dawn, the wide plain revealed two armies facing each other across history. Ranks of men, forests of spears, slow fluttering banners, and chariots shining in the first light of the sun. The morning air was cold and still, as if the world was holding its breath. Alexander took his position on the right wing, visible and unhidden, as if telling Darius that he stood openly before him. Darius stood in the center of his army on a royal chariot, surrounded by guards and senior commanders. His place was safe, but it was far from the living pulse of the front lines. When the signal was given, the battle began with the rush of Persian chariots, a weapon designed to sow panic and tear gaps in enemy ranks. The spinning blades at their sides were meant to rip through soldiers before close combat even began. Alexander had anticipated this. He ordered his men to open corridors in their line at the last moment so the chariots would pass through without smashing the formation. The chariots suddenly found themselves running between disciplined ranks instead of cutting through them. They lost effect and were then attacked from the sides and rear. This early failure shook Persian confidence. Still, they relied on their main advantage, overwhelming numbers. Waves of infantry and cavalry pressed hard on the Macedonian left. At the same time, Alexander began to execute the core of his plan, a slanting attack toward a weak point in the Persian center where Darius himself stood, while his left struggled defensively. Alexander rode with the companion cavalry at the head of a sharp wedge that pierced the middle. The movement was sudden and decisive. The Persian center started to crack. Some units pulled back without clear orders, and confusion spread. Step by step, Alexander's path toward Darius shortened. When the king realized the danger to his own life, fear entered his heart. He no longer thought as a commander, but as a monarch, whose personal survival symbolized the survival of the state. He chose to withdraw with his guard, hoping to regroup later. In reality, this retreat was the beginning of the end. Persian armies drew their strength from seeing their king firm behind them. The moment Darius disappeared from sight, more parts of the army collapsed. Persian resistance dissolved into fragments, and with continued Macedonian pressure, the great army lost its coherence. Alexander did not let his men dissolve into reckless pursuit. He kept discipline, pursuing only as far as his plan required. For him, the key result was not the number of fallen enemies but the political effect. Gaugamela was not simply a tactical victory. It was the strike that broke the backbone of the Persian Empire from above. The road now lay open to the main capitals he had dreamed of reaching: Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis. In the following days, Alexander marched to Babylon. The city opened its gates without real resistance, surrendering itself to the new master with a strange mixture of respect and resignation. Babylon was wide and richly decorated, its streets stretching like calm corridors in a painting, its gardens soft and shaded. There Alexander gave his soldiers a period of rest and began to organize its affairs. He did not loot its treasuries or destroy its temples. He treated it as a major center of civilization, no less important than the cities of his own homeland. Yet even in this calm he did not forget his unfinished business. Darius still lived, and the empire still existed in name. He continued east to Susa, another rich and splendid city, and then to Persepolis, the heart of Persian royal pride. Persepolis was more than a capital. It was a physical monument to the Achaemenid dynasty. Rising on a high terrace with long stairways and stone reliefs showing delegates from many nations bringing gifts to their king. Approaching it, Alexander felt that he was not just entering a city but stepping into the center of a long tradition of power. When he entered, he met little resistance. Local rulers knew that any defense would only postpone the inevitable. Now came one of the most debated scenes of his life, the burning of Persepolis. After some weeks of residence in the city, a great fire broke out in the royal palace complex. One story says that during a night of drinking, a Greek woman filled with hatred for Persia reminded Alexander of what the Persians had once done to Athens, and urged him to burn the palace in revenge. Some accounts say he agreed in a moment of heated emotion, then regretted it later. Others claim it was a cold political decision to erase the symbolic center of the old empire so it could never rise again. Whatever the exact truth, the palace burned. Flames consumed its fine wooden beams and spread over its decorated halls. The glow of fire mixed with gold and stone, and Alexander watched in silence as if seeing a long chapter of history close in light and smoke. The quiet that surrounded him in that moment was heavy. Some soldiers felt triumph, others felt as if something older than revenge was being destroyed, something of the Eastern soul itself. The fire did not erase Persepolis entirely, but it left a psychological scar on Alexander. After that night, he became more serious, less eager for bright celebrations. He began to think of himself more as a builder of a new empire than a mere destroyer of the old. With Persepolis under his control, almost all of Persia was now his. Only Darius remained, fleeing toward the far northeast in a last attempt to hold onto the fading shadow of his rule. Calmly and firmly, Alexander decided to pursue him, not out of personal anger, but to close a long page before opening another in Central Asia and beyond. The chase that followed looked like a journey between two worlds, one dying and one newly born. Darius had little left but his name and a few remaining loyalists. The lands into which Alexander now moved were harsh. The regions of Bactria and Sogdiana, the areas of modern Afghanistan and lands beyond the great rivers. They were not like the rich Persian cities or the ordered plains he had seen before. Here there were rough mountains, narrow valleys, deserts, and hidden passes. The tribes of these regions were not like the Persians. They were fierce warriors used to sudden attacks and quick retreats. They knew every cliff and every path the way a shepherd knows his grazing routes. In these places, time itself felt heavier. The years Alexander had spent in the earlier East were filled with battles, but they were relatively clear. Here every step seemed to require a fight, and no fight ended with a final clean victory. For the first time some of his men felt that expansion had lost its clear horizon. But Alexander did not see it that way. He insisted that finishing the road was necessary, not optional. He would say that a man who stops at half the world will be remembered as half a man. During this phase, the fatigue of his army grew slowly but surely. Faces changed, scars multiplied, and the distance between victory and victory seemed longer. Evenings in the camps became more silent than before. The songs of Macedonia were no longer sung as often. Men fell asleep quickly and woke slowly, as if walking inside a dream with no obvious end. Still, they followed him. In one of the long pursuits in Sogdiana, Alexander was badly wounded. For a moment his men saw clearly that their leader, who always rode in front, could die at any random instant. Soft whispers spread through the army. Where are we going, and when will this endless road stop? Alexander, who now believed deeply that his life was guided by destiny, did not slow down. At the same time, he began drawing more Persian nobles close to him and giving them roles in his administration and army. He sometimes wore Persian ceremonial dress in public events. This troubled many Macedonians and Greeks, who felt their own identity fading inside a larger Eastern shape. Some officers began to feel strangers within their own army. Alexander saw things differently. If they wanted to rule the East, he believed they could not remain entirely separate from it. To him, the empire had to belong to both, not be a cage for one side. Despite the stubborn resistance of local tribes, Alexander eventually subdued the regions of Bactria and Sogdiana after years of campaigns. He emerged from this chapter more silent, more unbending in will, and more isolated in feeling. Yet this was only a bridge to the last great phase of his journey. Now he began to speak of India, a land his soldiers had never seen, full of thick forests, heavy rivers, strange animals, and humid air. He heard that it was the land of elephants and warrior kings, the last great stretch of land before the end of the world. He smiled when he heard people say that the earth ended there, because every time someone told him that a road ended, he felt more desire to cross beyond it. After years of climbing in harsh mountains and marching across dry highlands, Alexander finally stood on the banks of the Indus. There his soldiers began to understand that they were on the edge of a new chapter that did not resemble anything before. When the army set foot in India for the first time, many soldiers felt that they were entering through a gate into a different world. The warm, heavy air was different from the dry winds of Central Asia, and wide rivers moved slowly between thick trees filled with calls of unfamiliar birds. Morning mists lay over the fields, giving them a soft, almost dreamlike layer. For the first time in years, some of the men felt a new kind of wonder, but with it came a deep unease. This land was strange in its plants and animals and customs. Even the smell of the earth was new, rich and layered as if hiding stories buried for 1,000 years. The practical reality of war, however, did not change. In the interior of this land waited a powerful ruler named Porus, a tall and impressive king who trusted in a force Alexander's men had never seriously faced before: war elephants. To the Macedonian soldiers, elephants were enormous living walls. Each could crush a whole formation under its feet, and some were armored and carried small platforms on their backs, with archers and spearmen. The sight of such animals was unsettling for men used to relying on speed and tight formation. How do you face a creature that moves like a walking fortress, and how do you stop it without letting it shatter your lines? Alexander reached the swollen river Hydaspes, where Porus waited on the opposite bank with his army. The water was high and turbulent from the summer rains, making a direct crossing impossible. Once again, Alexander preferred cleverness over blunt collision. For days he moved his forces up and down his side of the river, as if searching in vain for a crossing. Each time he moved, Porus shifted his own troops to face him, thinking the crossing would happen there. After many repetitions, the Indians began to believe that this movement was nothing but bluff. On a dark, rainy night, Alexander took a selected force of cavalry and infantry and secretly marched to a distant bend. There, hidden by darkness and the noise of the storm, they crossed with difficulty to the other side. At dawn, Porus discovered that Alexander was now on his bank, ready for battle. The ground was muddy after the rains, the sky heavy with grey clouds that gave everything a quiet, serious tone. Porus rode into the field on the back of a large war elephant decorated with royal markings and ornaments, a strong image of dignity for his men. Alexander, as usual, commanded his cavalry from the front. The battle began with a slow, heavy clash. The elephants advanced like living storms, and the earth shivered under their weight. The Macedonian front ranks were shaken, some horses panicked, and some soldiers stepped back in fear. Alexander did not allow that momentary disorder to grow into collapse. He ordered his archers and javelin men to aim at the drivers of the elephants, then at the animals' eyes and sides. Little by little, the elephants began to suffer and lose control, some turning in confusion against their own lines. In time, the very strength that Porus depended on turned against his army, as frightened elephants trampled friendly soldiers by mistake. Alexander used his cavalry to attack the wings, and slowly bent the Indian formation. The fight was long and exhausting, one of the heaviest his army had ever endured. When it finally ended, Alexander did not treat Porus as a broken enemy but as a king worthy of respect. He asked him how he wished to be treated, and Porus answered simply, as a king. Impressed by his courage and dignity, Alexander kept him as ruler over his land and even expanded his authority. This behavior reflected a new stage of Alexander's thinking. He was no longer only the man who takes away thrones, he could also grant them. Behind this victory, however, the deep tiredness of his men became impossible to ignore. They were worn down by distance, climate, continuous battles, and an endless feeling of exile. Every night, quiet questions circled their fires: how much farther and for how long? After Hydaspes, as the army pushed deeper into India, the gap between Alexander's vision and his soldiers' wishes widened. He still dreamed of reaching the great outer ocean at the edge of the world. He wanted to say to history that he had reached the last land. But history, geography, and his own army's strength were no longer on his side. Near another great river, he gathered his commanders and announced his intention to march farther east. He waited for the usual roar of agreement, but this time only silence rose round him. It was a thick, heavy silence, like morning fog over the Indian fields. It did not express respect, but resistance. One by one his officers spoke, at first with hesitation, Then, with clearer words, they reminded him of the years of marching, of friends buried far from home, of bodies and minds that could not bear infinite war. Even the most loyal to him said simply that they wanted to return home. For the first time since the beginning of the campaign, the Macedonian army stood united against the wish of its king. It was not a noisy revolt or chaotic mutiny. It was a deep, calm refusal from men who had reached their limit. Alexander tried to persuade them, reminding them of past victories and future glory, but this time his words did not find the same hearts as before. He stood before a wall that did not move. A commander may conquer continents, but he cannot move men who have nothing left to give. After days of solitude and thought, he returned to them with a quiet decision. They would turn back. No cheers of triumph echoed in the camp, only a long collective exhale, as if thousands of chests released years of hidden tension. This sigh was the true breaking point of the march. It was not that Alexander lost a battle. It was that, for the first time, he had lost his own forward pull. The journey home began, but it was neither direct nor easy. He had to reorganize regions, fix garrisons along the way, and try to preserve what he had created over long years. Even so, it was clear that the soul of the army had changed. The men now dreamed more of simple warmth in Macedonia than of echoes of glory in unknown lands. Alexander walked among them more silently than ever. He no longer spoke of tomorrows with the same shining tone. His eyes turned toward the west again, but they also held the weight of what had been lost. With each step on the road back, the legend of Alexander grew larger while the human being inside him grew more tired. He returned at last to Babylon, not as the rushing conqueror eager for the next battle. He returned as a king worn by long roads, years of command and constant reaching toward a horizon that always moved away. Babylon was for him more than a city. It was a natural center for a world empire, fertile, linked to all trade routes, and alive with many peoples and languages. There he began to think about the future again, but the future no longer looked like the past. It was not loud or filled with heroic pictures. It was hazy, quiet, and full of unknown possibilities. He reorganized the empire, appointing governors and sharing provinces among trusted commanders. He received envoys from near and far, some coming in sincere submission, others in fear, and some simply to flatter the new master of Asia. He even began to build plans for a great fleet and new campaigns, this time toward the Arabian lands. It was as if he wanted to escape from silence by planning yet another movement. On the surface, everything seemed under control. Inside the army, the palaces, and within Alexander himself, something else was unfolding. The soldiers who had returned from India carried heavy memories and a deep, quiet longing for home. The commanders who had gained power during the campaigns now had their own loyalties and ambitions. Alexander himself had never been more alone. Many of his old friends were gone, dead in battle or lost through conflict and suspicion. His closest companion, Hephaestion, had died not long before, leaving a painful emptiness in Alexander's heart. It is said that when he heard the news, he neither ate nor drank for several days, walking in his funeral with the face of a man who could no longer hide his grief. This loss marked the beginning of a slow inner decline in a leader whom no army had defeated. As the days in Babylon passed, Alexander felt a strange fatigue settle into his body, a fever that rose and fell, a weariness that did not seem to come from war alone. Still, he did not stop working, attending meetings, giving orders, and drawing plans. He talked about the Arabian campaign as if he could outrun the heavy silence creeping in. One warm evening he held a banquet with his commanders in Babylon. The night was still, Torches cast a soft golden light on the walls, and voices filled the hall in quiet conversation. After the banquet, the fever took hold of him again, this time more fiercely. He was carried to his room as his strength began to ebb. The following days took on a strange shape. His temperature rose, his voice weakened, and his body slowly lost its power hour by hour. Commanders gathered around him, struggling to imagine that the man who had crossed half the earth and toppled an empire could be laid low by something they could not even see. In his final moments, they asked him to whom he left his vast empire. His answer, according to the old stories, was brief: to the strongest. Then his breath faded in a quiet night of early summer in the year 323 before Christ. He was not yet 33 years old. A journey that had begun in Pella ended in Babylon. It was a short life in the measure of time, but a storm in the measure of human experience. With his death, not only Babylon trembled, but the ancient world itself. The moment the body was gone, struggle for his inheritance exploded. The great imperial dream broke into fragments, fought over by his generals. Yet the silence of that last night in Babylon hid a larger truth. Alexander had gone, but the stories he created stayed awake across the centuries. Now, if you wish, close your eyes for a moment and imagine the scene from very high above. Lines of mountains fading at the edge of vision, wide plains, long rivers, and cities that changed hands and languages and banners. At the center of all this, the life of one man who kept running as if he feared time itself might overtake him. Alexander the Great was not only a conqueror and not only a sword cutting through old maps. He was a human story, a person who believed the world was too large and too rich to leave unchanged, who tried to melt peoples together and build bridges between East and West. He succeeded in some things and failed in others. He won many victories and sometimes lost what was more precious than victory. In the end, he was still human, passing through life as we do, making mistakes as we do, dreaming and paying the cost of his dreams. When we look back at his long road from Macedonia to Babylon, from youthful triumphs to the final fever in that quiet room, we discover that history is not as noisy as some imagine. In truth, it is very calm, like night. Fates move slowly, lives repeat, names pass like caravans of sand. No matter how loud the noise in their own time, everything ends in a stillness, much like the stillness around you now. The page of Alexander has been folded, as the pages of many kings were folded before him and will be folded after him. The story he left, with all its glory and contradictions, gently reminds us that greatness does not give its owner rest. Running after everything can in the end make us lose the meaning of things. Now there is no need to walk any farther. No battles await you, no long roads, no rivers to cross, no swords raised in the dawn. The world can wait until morning. For now, you are allowed to rest. Breathe in slowly, a long, calm breath, then let it out even more slowly. Let your thoughts settle like dust settling after an army has passed. Let maps be folded, tents taken down, torches put out, and horses resting by the river. The world can wait until morning, but you can rest now. Sleep well, and let history guard your dreams instead of worrying you. The night was made so that we can lay our heads down and finally let the past fall asleep.